February 24, 1944. South of Cisterna, Italy, along muddy roads that had claimed countless vehicles. American tankers from the 1st Armored Division approached cautiously, surrounding a massive German Elephant tank destroyer. The 70-ton behemoth sat motionless, abandoned after engine fire had forced its crew to flee. Its heavy armor bore scars from American tank rounds, marks that told a story of futility, each shell having bounced harmlessly off the 200mm frontal plate. These weren't rookie crews examining the beast. These were veterans who'd battled German armor from North Africa's deserts through Sicily's hills and now into Italy's unforgiving mountains. They knew every Panzer variant, every assault gun, every tank destroyer the Wehrmacht possessed. And one thing united every single German armored vehicle they'd encountered: machine guns. Lots of them. MG-34S and MG-42S bristling from every angle for close-in defense. But as they circled this German monster, inspecting it up close for the first time, something stopped them cold. There was no machine gun coverage. Almost none whatsoever. The vehicle mounted a single ball-mounted machine gun in the hull front, fixed to fire straight ahead. Nothing on the sides. Nothing at the rear. Nothing in the superstructure. The realization hit them like a shockwave. This seemingly invincible machine, with armor thick enough to laugh off American tank shells and a gun powerful enough to kill at 3 kilometers, could barely defend itself against a single soldier approaching from the flanks or rear. The Germans had constructed one of the most heavily armored, most powerfully armed tank destroyers in the world, then given it almost zero ability to protect itself against infantry attack. This discovery validated what intelligence reports from the Eastern Front had been suggesting. The Ferdinand, later renamed Elephant, represented simultaneously a triumph of German heavy armor engineering and a catastrophic failure of practical design thinking. Its story would fundamentally reshape American understanding of how not to build armored fighting vehicles. Understanding how such a design error could occur requires understanding the Ferdinand's unusual birth. In 1942, the German military organized a competition for a new heavy tank that would dominate battlefields across Europe and Russia. 2 companies competed. Henschel and Son submitted a conventional design with a turret mounted near the center of the hull, proven, reliable, traditional. Ferdinand Porsche, personal friend of Adolf Hitler and renowned automotive engineer, submitted a radical design using an electric drive system with engines positioned in the middle of the hull. Porsche was so supremely confident his design would win that he ordered 100 chassis built before the competition even concluded at the Nibelungenwerk factory in St. Valentin, Austria. His confidence proved disastrously misplaced. During evaluation trials at Burka in April 1942, the Porsche design struggled badly in deep mud and suffered chronic mechanical problems with its novel petrol-electric transmission. The Henschel design proved far more reliable and won the contract, becoming the famous Tiger I tank that would terrorize Allied forces for years. Porsche's 100 pre-built chassis represented a massive investment with no immediate purpose. Rather than scrap them, an admission of failure and waste, German High Command decided to convert these chassis into heavy tank destroyers. Engineers moved the engines forward and built a massive fixed casemate at the rear to house the main gun. The result was the Panzerjäger Tiger P, officially designated SDKFZ 184, but better known by its unofficial name Ferdinand, after its designer. Between March and May 1943, 91 vehicles were converted. The specifications were genuinely extraordinary. The Ferdinand weighed 65 tons, making it one of the heaviest armored fighting vehicles in service anywhere in 1943. Its frontal armor measured 200 millimeters thick, achieved by bolting an additional 100 millimeters plate to the original 100 millimeters hull front. This made the Ferdinand's frontal armor twice as thick as the Tiger I. No Allied or Soviet anti-tank gun then in service could penetrate that armor from the front at typical combat ranges. The main armament was the 8.8 centimeters Pak 43 halves with an L/71 barrel, one of the most powerful anti-tank weapons ever mounted on a tracked vehicle. This gun could penetrate 190 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters and destroy a Soviet T 34 tank at ranges exceeding 3 kilometers. Soviet tankers would later report Ferdinands destroying their vehicles from distances so great that the German tank destroyer appeared as merely a distant speck on the horizon. Inside the armored casemate, for crew members, worked the gun. The commander directed fire, the gunner aimed and fired, and two loaders serviced the massive 88mm rounds. The driver and radio operator sat in a separate compartment at the very front of the hull, completely isolated from the fighting compartment. Communication between the front and rear crew positions was only possible by radio, an unusual arrangement that would prove problematic during combat. But the Ferdinand had serious weaknesses extending far beyond its lack of defensive armament. The two Maybach HL-120 engines, originally designed for much lighter vehicles, struggled desperately to move the 65-ton mass. Maximum road speed was only 30 kilometers per hour. Cross-country speed dropped to a crawling 10 kilometers per hour, slower than a man could jog. The complex petrol-electric drive system was sophisticated but temperamental, prone to overheating in the confined engine compartment. The suspension system lacked return rollers, a cost-saving measure that dramatically increased track wear. The tracks themselves, already stressed by the enormous weight, wore out quickly. Spare parts were chronically short. The vehicle's cross-country range was only 90 kilometers before requiring refueling, barely adequate for offensive operations. Recovery of damaged or broken-down Ferdinands required multiple Bergpanzer IV recovery vehicles working together, as a single vehicle could not move the massive weight. All 91 Ferdinands were assigned to two heavy tank destroyer battalions. Schwer Panzerjägerabteilung 653 received 45 vehicles. Schwer Panzerjägerabteilung 654 received 44 vehicles. Together these battalions formed Heavy Panzer Regiment 656 under the command of Oberst Rudolf Geel. The combat debut came at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. Operation Citadel represented Germany's attempt to eliminate the massive Soviet salient around the city of Kursk through a double envelopment. Adolf Hitler had postponed the offensive repeatedly, waiting for new weapons like the Panther tank and the Ferdinand to arrive. He believed these wonder weapons would offset Soviet numerical superiority and deliver decisive victory. 89 Ferdinands deployed for the northern pincer of the attack as part of Field Marshal Walter Model's 9th Army. Before combat even began, 6 vehicles had to be withdrawn for mechanical repairs, a troubling sign of things to come. The remaining 83 Ferdinands prepared to spearhead the German assault. On July 5, 1943, at approximately 0530 hours, Operation Citadel began. The Germans launched their attack following a massive artillery bombardment. The Ferdinands rolled forward as part of the assault spearheads, their mission to destroy Soviet anti-tank guns and tanks at long range, allowing lighter German armor and infantry to advance behind them. Initially, the Ferdinands performed exactly as designed. Their powerful guns destroyed Soviet tanks before the T-34s could close to effective range. Their thick armor shrugged off Soviet anti-tank fire that would have destroyed conventional German tanks. Soviet tankers were shocked to see their shells bouncing harmlessly off the 200mm frontal armor. Some Soviet tank crews abandoned their positions rather than face the seemingly invincible German monsters. But Soviet defensive preparations were far more extensive than German intelligence had estimated. The Central Front alone had laid over 400,000 anti-tank mines across multiple defensive belts. The Ferdinand's great weight made them particularly vulnerable to mine damage. When a mine detonated under a track, the resulting damage often broke the suspension, bent the track itself, or destroyed road wheels. The 65-ton weight made field repairs nearly impossible. Of the 45 Ferdinands from Schwer Panzerjägerabteilung 653 committed on the first day, all but 12 were immobilized by mine damage before 1,700 hours. Most would eventually be repaired and returned to service, but the recovery of such massive vehicles from an active battlefield proved extraordinarily difficult. Soviet demolition teams went out at night to destroy abandoned Ferdinands with explosive charges. Even more devastating, Soviet infantry quickly discovered the Ferdinand's fatal weakness. The vehicle had virtually no defensive capability against infantry attack. The main gun had limited traverse and could not depress far enough to engage targets close to the vehicle. There were no machine guns anywhere on the vehicle for close defense. Once Soviet infantry closed the distance, Ferdinand crews had few options. Soviet infantry tactics adapted within days. Special anti-tank teams learned to let the Ferdinands pass over their positions in trenches and foxholes. Soviet soldiers had undergone training to overcome tank phobia, including exercises where tanks drove directly over occupied trenches. Once the Ferdinands passed the first defensive line, infantrymen would emerge from cover with PTRD, 41 anti-tank rifles, demolition charges, and Molotov cocktails. The PTRD 41 rifle could not penetrate the Ferdinand's thick armor, but it could damage the engine deck, tracks, and vision blocks. A well-aimed shot to the engine grills could start fires or damage cooling systems. Shots to the tracks could immobilize the vehicle. Once a Ferdinand was immobilized, Soviet infantry swarmed it with Molotov cocktails and grenades. Molotov cocktails splashed burning fuel across engine decks. Grenades dropped onto ventilation grills filled the interior with smoke and shrapnel. Ferdinand crews were trapped. They could not see infantrymen crouching beside their vehicles due to extremely limited vision. They could not shoot them because there were no machine guns. They could not drive away if their tracks were damaged. Their only option was to abandon the vehicle and try to reach friendly lines on foot, which often proved fatal. Some desperate crews attempted improvised defenses. A few tried firing their personal MG-42 machine guns down the barrel of the main gun, traversing the entire 88mm gun to aim at attackers. This proved absurd, dangerous, and largely ineffective. Other crews opened hatches to fire pistols and submachine guns, exposing themselves to enemy fire. These desperate measures rarely saved the vehicle. The Battle of Kursk turned into a disaster for the Ferdinands. While they achieved impressive kill ratios when engaging Soviet armor at long range, they suffered devastating losses to mines and infantry attack. German records claim Schwer Panzerjägerabteilung 653 destroyed 320 enemy tanks, while losing 13 Ferdinands in combat. Combined claims for both battalions exceeded 500 Soviet tanks destroyed. However, these impressive statistics masked the reality. Most Ferdinand losses came not from enemy tanks, but from mine damage, mechanical breakdown, and infantry attack. The vehicles that excelled in long-range defensive combat were being misused as breakthrough weapons in offensive operations across heavily mined Soviet defensive belts. By July 12, when Hitler canceled Operation Citadel following the Allied invasion of Sicily, roughly 50 Ferdinands remained operational out of the 89 that began the battle. The Kursk experience forced German commanders to acknowledge the Ferdinands' critical design flaws. In fall 1943, all surviving Ferdinands were ordered back to Germany for comprehensive modifications. The refitting process took several months at Nibelungenwerk. Engineers added a ball-mounted MG-34 machine gun in the hull front for the radio operator position, giving the vehicle at least some defensive capability against infantry attack. They installed a new commander's cupola with 7 vision blocks, the same type used on the Stu-G3 assault gun, dramatically improving the commander's ability to observe the battlefield. They applied Simmerit anti-magnetic mine paste to the hull and superstructure. They improved the engine grille design to provide better protection. The modifications added 5 tons to the vehicle's weight, bringing the total to 70 tons. No improvements were made to the engines or transmission, so the already underpowered Ferdinand became even more sluggish. On May 1, 1944, Hitler personally ordered the vehicle officially renamed from Ferdinand to Elephant. In February 1944, 11 of the newly modified Elephants were rushed to Italy. The first company of Schwer Panzerjägerabteilung 653, commanded by Oberleutnant Helmuth Ulrich, deployed to counter the Allied landing at Anzio. American and British forces had landed south of Rome in an attempt to outflank the German defensive lines. The mountainous terrain of Italy proved even more challenging than the Russian steppe. Narrow mountain roads with steep grades and hairpin turns were never designed for 70-ton vehicles. Bridges built for civilian traffic could not support the Elephant's weight. The vehicles had to ford streams, climb rocky slopes, and navigate terrain that challenged even much lighter tanks. Mechanical breakdowns were constant. The stressed engines overheated on steep climbs. Transmissions failed under the strain. Tracks wore out at alarming rates with no replacements available in Italy. When an Elephant broke down on a narrow mountain road, it blocked the entire route until it could be recovered or pushed aside. American tank crews got their first close look at an Elephant when Vehicle 102 from 2nd Company broke down with engine fire near Cisterna in late May 1944. The crew abandoned it and American engineers examined it thoroughly. They confirmed what intelligence reports from the Eastern Front had indicated. The vehicle possessed extraordinary armor and firepower, but suffered from critical vulnerabilities. American intelligence reports noted the Elephant's extremely limited crew vision, particularly to the sides and rear. The single hull-mounted machine gun provided inadequate defensive fire, covering only a narrow arc directly forward. Most significantly, the vehicle's great weight and underpowered drivetrain made it highly vulnerable to mechanical failure. American forces concluded they need not fear this vehicle in offensive operations, as it would likely break down before reaching the battlefield. American tactical doctrine emphasized avoiding frontal engagements where the Elephant's armor and gun gave it overwhelming advantage. Instead, American forces maneuvered to attack from flanks or rear, waited for the vehicles to break down, or called in artillery and air support against the Elephant's thin side and rear armor. Of the 11 Elephants initially sent to Italy, at least 3 survived to be evacuated in August 1944. The others were lost throughout the spring and summer of 1944. Ferdinand 114 was destroyed March 1st. Ferdinand 131 was knocked out March 2nd. Ferdinand 113 was lost May 25th. Multiple vehicles were destroyed in June fighting around Cisterna. Most losses resulted from mechanical breakdown rather than enemy action. The Allies captured Elephant Vehicle 102, which had originally been Ferdinand 633 at Kursk. It was eventually shipped to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland for detailed testing. American engineers conducted extensive evaluations, confirming the vehicle's strengths and weaknesses. The tests validated that while the Elephant was formidable in its designed role, it was impractical for actual battlefield conditions. The remaining Elephants on the Eastern Front saw continued combat through 1944, mostly in defensive operations in Ukraine. 2 companies, totaling 28 Elephants, deployed to reinforce Army Group South positions near Tarnopol. The vehicles proved effective when properly employed in ambush positions with infantry support, but there were never enough of them to make a strategic difference. Attrition from combat and mechanical breakdown steadily reduced their numbers. A small group of Elephants participated in defensive battles during the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945. As Soviet forces pushed deep into Poland, the last surviving Elephants fought in the defensive battles south of Berlin in April 1945. By the end of the war, only 2 Elephants survived intact. One Ferdinand, captured by Soviet forces at Kursk in July 1943, is now displayed at the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow. The Elephant captured by American forces in Italy now resides at Fort Gregg Adams in Virginia. The fundamental question remained: how could German engineers design a 65-ton tank destroyer without adequate means to defend against infantry? The answer lay in the vehicle's improvised origin and the assumptions built into German doctrine. The Ferdinand was never intended to operate alone. German combined arms doctrine called for tank destroyers to work with infantry support. The infantry would protect the vehicle from enemy infantry, while the tank destroyer engaged enemy armor at long range. On paper, this doctrine made perfect sense. In practice, infantry could not always keep pace with armored vehicles, especially across mined terrain or through fortified positions. Infantry might be pinned down by enemy fire, while tank destroyers continued forward. In night operations or poor visibility, infantry and armor could become separated. Any of these situations left the Ferdinand defenseless, and all of them occurred regularly at Kursk. German designers had become overconfident in their armor design philosophy. They prioritized maximum armor protection and maximum firepower, while assuming proper tactics would compensate for other deficiencies. The Ferdinands designers believed its thick armor would protect it from anti-tank weapons, and its long-range gun would keep enemy tanks at safe distance. They did not adequately consider close-range infantry threats despite years of combat experience, showing immobilized or isolated tanks were extremely vulnerable. The decision to build the Ferdinand without adequate machine guns was a conscious design choice, not an oversight. It reflected specific assumptions about employment that proved fatally flawed in actual combat. The vehicle was optimized for a very narrow tactical role: long-range anti-tank combat from prepared defensive positions with guaranteed infantry support. When used in that exact scenario, the Ferdinand was devastatingly effective. But war rarely allows such ideal circumstances. For American tank designers, the Ferdinand/Elephant provided valuable negative lessons. It demonstrated that paper specifications do not translate to battlefield effectiveness. A vehicle could have the thickest armor and most powerful gun in the world, but still fail if it could not be maintained in the field, if it could not reach its fighting position, or if it could not defend against all threat types. American tank destroyer doctrine emphasized very different priorities. Vehicles like the M10 and M36 had much less armor than the Ferdinand, but were faster, more reliable, mechanically simpler, and equipped with multiple machine guns for self-defense. They were designed for mobility and practical functionality rather than maximum protection. American doctrine accepted that tank destroyers would rely on concealment and maneuver rather than heavy armor. The contrast was stark. Germans built the ultimate defensive tank destroyer and discovered that ultimate defensive capability meant nothing if the vehicle could not survive approaching its defensive position. Americans built less impressive but more practical vehicles that could actually accomplish their missions under real battlefield conditions. The story of the Ferdinand/Elephant illustrates the danger of over-specialization in weapons design. When circumstances matched the vehicle's narrow design parameters, it was nearly unstoppable. But when circumstances deviated even slightly, its weaknesses became catastrophic. Minefields immobilized it. Mechanical problems sidelined it. Infantry attacks destroyed it. The vehicle consumed scarce resources while delivering limited overall combat effectiveness. Today, military historians study the Ferdinand/Elephant as a cautionary tale about practical design versus theoretical performance. The vehicle appears in armor development courses as an example of how impressive specifications can mask critical operational deficiencies. It demonstrates that weapons must be designed for harsh battlefield realities where nothing goes according to plan, not for ideal conditions that rarely exist. The two surviving examples stand as monuments to both German engineering ambition and the limits of over-specialized design. Museum visitors marvel at the massive gun and incredibly thick armor. Then they notice the single small machine gun covering only the front arc, and they understand immediately why this seemingly invincible machine was actually quite vulnerable. The most powerful tank destroyer of 1943, rendered helpless by the simplest threat: a man on foot with a grenade. For the Soviet infantrymen who stalked Ferdinands across the killing fields of Kursk in summer 1943, the lack of defensive armament was a critical vulnerability they exploited ruthlessly. They developed specific tactics to defeat these monsters, knowing that if they could close the distance, they could destroy a 65-ton steel fortress with weapons as primitive as a bottle of gasoline and a burning rag. For the American tankers who faced elephants in the mountains of Italy in spring 1944, the knowledge that the vehicle had extremely limited defensive capability and chronic mechanical problems reduced the fear factor considerably. They learned to avoid the elephant's killing zone at the front and instead maneuvered to attack from positions where American guns could penetrate, or simply waited for the inevitable mechanical breakdown. The Ferdinand/Elephant ultimately proved that victory in modern warfare comes not from building the most powerful individual weapon, but from building practical weapons that soldiers can employ effectively under actual combat conditions. The tank destroyer that could barely defend itself against infantry became a perfect example of flawed design philosophy, a lesson that influenced armored vehicle development for decades afterward. In the end, Ferdinand Porsche's repurposed chassis became one of the most controversial weapons of World War II. It achieved remarkable kill ratios when used exactly as designed. It inspired fear in enemy tankers who faced its massive gun and impenetrable frontal armor. But it also consumed enormous resources, suffered catastrophic losses to simple threats, and ultimately contributed little to Germany's strategic position. The Ferdinand/Elephant stands as proof that in warfare, practical functionality matters more than impressive specifications, and that the most advanced weapon is not always the most effective weapon. The vehicle's story resonates today in modern military procurement debates. When defense contractors present weapons with extraordinary capabilities on paper, military planners remember the Ferdinand, a vehicle that looked unstoppable in specifications but proved vulnerable in practice. The lesson extends beyond armored vehicles. Any weapon system optimized for a narrow set of ideal circumstances risks becoming useless when reality intrudes. The fighter jet that cannot operate from damaged runways. The missile system that requires perfect weather. The naval vessel that cannot be maintained at sea. All echo the Ferdinand's fundamental flaw: theoretical superiority undermined by practical vulnerability. Modern military doctrine emphasizes flexibility, maintainability, and multi-role capability precisely because the Ferdinand demonstrated the danger of over-specialization. The U.S. military's preference for good enough systems that work reliably under all conditions over perfect systems that work ideally under optimal conditions traces directly to lessons learned from German superweapons like the Ferdinand. The Ferdinand also demonstrated the danger of allowing political considerations to override practical military judgment. The vehicle existed primarily because scrapping Porsche's 100 pre-built chassis would have been politically embarrassing. Rather than admit the waste and move on, German leadership doubled down, converting them into a weapon that looked impressive but had fundamental flaws. This pattern repeated throughout German weapons development during World War II. The Tiger II tank, the Maus Super Heavy tank, the V-2 rocket, all consumed enormous resources while delivering limited battlefield impact. All prioritized impressive specifications over practical effectiveness. All reflected a design philosophy that the Ferdinand epitomized. If we make it powerful enough and protect it heavily enough, nothing else matters. Soviet and American designers took the opposite approach. Their vehicles were simpler, more reliable, easier to produce, and designed for the messy reality of actual combat. When AT-34 broke down, field mechanics could fix it with basic tools. When a Sherman needed replacement parts, supply chains could deliver them. When an M10 encountered infantry, it had machine guns to defend itself. The Ferdinand had none of these practical advantages. It was a boutique weapon, a masterpiece of heavy engineering that required perfect conditions to function effectively. War does not provide perfect conditions. For collectors and historians, the surviving Ferdinands/Elephants are priceless artifacts. They represent a specific moment in military history when design philosophy diverged sharply between the major powers. They stand as physical evidence of the consequences when theoretical performance trumps practical design. The vehicle's massive gun, still imposing 70 years later, reminds visitors of the Ferdinand's lethal capability at long range. The incredibly thick armor, scarred by impacts that failed to penetrate, demonstrates the protection it offered. But that single lonely machine gun in the hull front tells the real story. A weapon so specialized it forgot the basics of survival on the battlefield. In the end, the Ferdinand/Elephant's greatest contribution to military history may be as a cautionary tale, a reminder that winning wars requires not wonder weapons, but practical tools that soldiers can use effectively under the worst possible conditions.